At 7:35 hours on June 6, 1944, Company Sergeant Major Charles Martin of the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada crouched in a landing craft approaching Bernier-sur. The 25-year-old from Cooksville, Ontario, watched the beach ahead, knowing that intelligence reports predicted heavy casualties. 14,000 Canadian troops would assault Juno Beach that morning. Allied commanders doubted the Canadians could succeed. Martin had served with the Queen's Own Rifles since June 1940 when the regiment mobilized for war. He trained in England for 4 years, rising from rifleman to company sergeant major, one of the youngest in regimental history. Now he commanded a company through its greatest test. The soldiers around him were farm workers, factory hands, and shop clerks from across Ontario. Most had never seen combat. They had trained endlessly, but training was not war. The memory of Depp haunted every Canadian soldier. That 1942 raid killed or captured more than 3,000 Canadians in 9 hours. Military planners remembered Depp and expected Juno Beach to fail the same way. The defensive position ahead was designated Wider Stands 27, a German strong point built into Bernier. The Wehrmacht's 716th Infantry Division had fortified the coastline with 75 guns, machine gun nests, concrete bunkers, barbed wire, and mines. They spent 3 years preparing these defenses. Allied doctrine required 1 numerical superiority to assault fortified beaches. The Canadians lacked that advantage. Naval bombardment stopped before the landing craft reached shore, giving German defenders time to recover from the shelling. Only 14% of beach fortifications had been destroyed by the preliminary bombardment. General Dwight Eisenhower approved the Juno Beach assault on February 12, 1944. He knew Juno Beach, positioned between British Gold and Sword Beaches, was among the most heavily defended sections of Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery inspected the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division in March 1944. His private assessment noted Canadian enthusiasm, but questioned their combat readiness. He assigned them Juno Beach regardless. Someone had to take it. Major General Rodney Keller commanded the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division. He graduated from Royal Military College in 1920 and served with the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry for 2 decades. His division included soldiers from every Canadian province. They trained relentlessly for 4 years in England, preparing for an invasion that kept being postponed. The problem was not preparation. The problem was expectation. Canadian soldiers knew what Allied commanders thought. British officers dismissed them as colonials. American generals barely acknowledged their existence in planning meetings. Within the Allied command structure, Canada was Britain's junior partner, allowed to participate, but not expected to lead or excel. That skepticism weighed on every Canadian as they crossed the English Channel on the night of June 5. The first Canadians died before reaching shore. Landing craft struck German mines and exploded. German 75 guns fired directly into approaching vessels. Roughly 30% of landing craft at Juno were destroyed or damaged. Soldiers who reached the beach faced annihilating fire from German positions designed to sweep the coastline horizontally. Men fell in groups as they ran toward the sea wall. Company B of the Royal Winnipeg Rifles lost half its strength in the first 10 minutes. The Queen's Own Rifles suffered 143 casualties on June 6, the highest of any Canadian battalion. The North Shore Regiment from New Brunswick took 125 casualties. The Readiness Rifles lost 108 men. Martin's landing craft touched down at 7:55 hours. As the ramp dropped, German machine gun fire rad. Martin later wrote in his memoir that he saw no evidence the preliminary bombardment had affected German defenses. The beach looked untouched. Soldiers jumped into chest-deep water and waded toward shore under continuous fire. Martin made it to the sea wall. Many did not. Within minutes, dozens of Queen's Own Rifle soldiers lay dead or wounded on the sand. By 900 hours, the Canadians had suffered devastating casualties, but had not broken. German commanders expected the assault to collapse. General Elnant Wilhelm Richter commanded the 716th Infantry Division defending Juno Beach. He anticipated that Canadian forces would fail as they had at Dieppe. He miscalculated. What RTOR failed to understand was that the Canadians had learned from Dieppe. Every mistake from that disaster had been studied intensively. The Canadian Army spent 2 years developing assault tactics specifically for beach landings. They trained with specialized armor, including duplex-drive amphibious tanks. They practiced combined infantry and armor coordination until it became instinctive. Most importantly, they trained with determination born from DP's memory. Every Canadian soldier at Juno Beach carried the weight of that earlier failure. They refused to repeat it. Martin led his company through a gap in the sea wall at approximately 9:15 hours. German resistance remained fierce. A machine gun position in a concrete pillbox controlled the street ahead. Martin and his men used grenades and concentrated rifle fire to suppress the defenders. They cleared the position and pushed into Burney. The fighting became intense house-to-house combat. Germans defended from inside buildings. Firing from windows and doorways, the Canadians adapted quickly, using explosives to blow holes through interior walls, moving between buildings without exposing themselves to street fire. They cleared houses room by room, floor by floor. It was brutal, methodical work. By 1,000 hours, the Queen's Own Rifles secured the eastern section of Bernier-Sumer despite heavy casualties. To the west, the Royal Winnipeg Rifles and Regina Rifle Regiment fought similar battles at Corso-Sumer. The town sat at the mouth of the Soy River, split by water into 2 defensive sectors. German fortifications covered both approaches. Both Canadian regiments faced withering fire from positions that survived the naval bombardment. Through aggressive infantry assaults supported by tanks from the 1st Hughes and Fort Garry Horse regiments, Canadian forces cleared the beach strong points by mid-morning. By 1100 hours, Canadian units were pushing inland. Allied planners expected beach fighting to consume the entire day. Montgomery's orders assumed securing the beach and coastal towns would be the maximum D-Day achievement. The Canadians exceeded those expectations dramatically. The 9th Canadian Infantry Brigade held in reserve landed at Bernier at 11:40 hours. Brigade Commander Brigadier Douglas Cunningham immediately pushed his units toward the interior. The North Nova Scotia Highlanders and Sherbrooke Fusiliers formed a combined arms column and drove south toward Breville-Logo. They moved rapidly, bypassing German resistance when possible, engaging only when necessary. This rapid advance created an unexpected situation. The German 21st Panzer Division stationed south of Khen had been ordered to counterattack the invasion beaches. They expected to hit Allied forces still struggling to establish beachheads. Instead, Canadian units were already 8 to 12 km inland, moving faster than any other Allied division on any beach. At 1300 hours, elements of the Sherbrooke Fusiliers reached the main road between Caen and Bayeux. This was the objective Allied planners hoped to reach by nightfall. The Canadians achieved it by early afternoon. That accomplishment represented something profound. For the first time in the war, a Canadian force not only met expectations, but dramatically exceeded them. Every other Allied division on D-Day faced similar or lighter German resistance. American forces at Omaha Beach fought heroically, but gained less than 2 km. British forces at Gold and Sword Beaches advanced 5 to 6 km. The Canadians at Juno Beach penetrated 10 to 12 km inland, the deepest Allied penetration of June 6, 1944. Success created new dangers. The rapid Canadian advance opened a gap between their eastern flank and British forces from Sword Beach. German commanders noticed. General Edgar Fittinger, commanding the 21st Panzer Division, saw an opportunity. His division had 75 tanks and supporting infantry. At 1600 hours, German armor attacked through the gap. Canadian and British forces fought German tanks with limited anti-tank support. The line held through 4 hours of intense fighting. At 2000 hours, A massive formation of Allied gliders flew overhead, carrying reinforcements for the British 6th Airborne Division. The sight convinced Fittinger that Allied air superiority was absolute. He withdrew. The counterattack collapsed. By nightfall on June 6, the Canadians achieved what no one expected. They secured all beach objectives, cleared 4 coastal towns, advanced 12 km inland, and linked up with British forces on both flanks. The cost was significant. 340 Canadians were killed, 574 were wounded, 47 were captured, but the mission succeeded beyond every projection. British historian John Keegan later wrote that at the end of June 6, Canadian forward elements stood deeper into France than those of any other division. The opposition Canadians faced was stronger than any beach except Omaha. That accomplishment merited considerable pride. Martin survived D-Day. He fought through Normandy and was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal for actions following the landing at Juno Beach. He later earned the Military Medal for courage during an attack in Germany in March 1945. He returned to Canada in August 1945 and settled near Cooksville, where he grew up. He and his wife operated a post office and general store while he worked for the Ontario Department of Agriculture. Martin remained active in his community as a school trustee and volunteer. For the 50th anniversary of D-Day in 1994, he wrote a memoir titled Battle Diary that remains among the most vivid portrayals of ordinary Canadian soldiers in the war. Martin died in October 1997. Mrs. Sorga named a trail after him and erected the Charlie Martin Memorial to recognize his wartime service and community contributions. The German army noticed Canadian performance immediately. Wehrmacht intelligence reports from June 7 described the Canadian advance as unexpectedly aggressive and professionally executed. German commanders who dismissed Canadians as inexperienced colonials revised their assessments overnight. After action, reports from the 716th Infantry Division noted that Canadian infantry demonstrated excellent small unit tactics, effective use of supporting armor, and remarkable battlefield adaptation. One German officer wrote that Canadians fought with intensity he had not seen since the Eastern Front. Allied command took longer to acknowledge Canadian capabilities. Montgomery praised the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division in official reports, but privately expressed surprise at their performance. American commanders focused on their sectors and paid little attention to Canadian achievements. Full recognition came only after weeks of continued Canadian success throughout the Normandy campaign. Before D-Day, Canadian forces had already proven themselves in the Mediterranean. The 1st Canadian Infantry Division and 1st Canadian Armored Brigade landed in Sicily on July 10, 1943, as part of Operation Husky. Initial resistance was light as Italian coastal divisions surrendered quickly. The advance through Sicily proved harder as German forces conducted fighting withdrawals using mountainous terrain. Canadian troops fought through intense heat across difficult terrain against skilled defenders. The town of Leonforte fell to the loyal Edmonton Regiment after 3 days of house-to-house fighting. Adjara required coordinated attacks by multiple Canadian units supported by artillery. By August 7, when Axis forces evacuated Sicily, Canadian troops had fought continuously for 4 weeks, gaining invaluable lessons about combined arms warfare, mountain fighting, and urban combat. The Italian mainland campaign began September 3, 1943, when Canadian forces crossed the Strait of Messina and landed at Reggio Calabria. The advance up the Italian peninsula became a brutal advance through mountains, rivers, and German defensive lines. The Moraro River crossing in December 1943 cost 1,400 Canadian casualties. The river was narrow, but German positions on the north bank commanded every approach. Canadian infantry attacked across open ground under heavy fire, while engineers built bridges under continuous shelling. Ortona came next. The medieval town sat on cliffs overlooking the Adriatic Sea. Narrow streets and stone buildings made it ideal for defense. German 1st Parachute Division held Ortona with orders to defend every house. Canadian forces attacked on December 20th. The loyal Edmonton Regiment and C4 Highlanders of Canada, supported by tanks from the Three Rivers Regiment, pushed into the town. German defenders booby-trapped buildings, mined streets, and positioned machine guns to cover every approach. Canadians developed mouse-holing tactics out of necessity. Moving through streets meant certain death. Moving through buildings by blasting holes in walls allowed progress while minimizing casualties. Soldiers fought room to room, often at point-blank range. Tank guns fired into buildings at close range, bringing down structures on German defenders. Christmas Day 1943 found Canadian soldiers still fighting in Ortona with no ceasefire. Finally, on December 28th, German forces withdrew. 1,375 Canadians died in the Morero River battles, including Ortona. British historian John Keegan called Ortona Canada's Stalingrad, comparing it to brutal Eastern Front urban fighting. The battle demonstrated Canadian soldiers could match German elite troops in the most difficult conditions. German commanders who fought at Ortona wrote afterward that they underestimated Canadian tactical ability and fighting spirit. They expected to hold Ortona indefinitely. Canadian determination and innovative tactics forced them out in 8 days. When operations resumed in May 1944, Canadians participated in massive Allied offensives aimed at breaking through the Gustav Line and capturing Rome. 1st Canadian Corps, now including both 1st Canadian Infantry Division and 5th Canadian Armored Division, attacked in the Lyre Valley. Canadian troops, supported by massive artillery, assaulted fortified positions across open ground. Tank battles raged across wheat fields. Infantry fought through villages and strong points. The Hitler Line fell to Canadian and British forces. On May 23rd, Rome was liberated. June 4th, Canadian troops were among the first Allied soldiers to enter the city. The Italian campaign cost Canada over 25,000 casualties, including more than 5,800 killed, but Canadian forces gained invaluable combat experience. Officers who later commanded in Northwest Europe learned their trade in Italy. Soldiers who landed in Sicily as Green troops left Italy as veterans. The battle for Caen became the next major test in Northwest Europe. After D-Day, German forces concentrated around Caen, determined to prevent Allied breakout from the beachhead. Caen sat at strategic crossroads, controlling access to the French interior. Montgomery ordered repeated attacks throughout June and July. Many fell to Canadian forces. The fighting was brutal. German SS Panzer divisions, including the 12th SS Hitler Youth Division, defended with fanatical determination. These experienced troops expected to crush inexperienced Canadians. They found themselves fighting equals. The 12th SS Division was particularly vicious, composed largely of teenage volunteers indoctrinated in Nazi ideology. They fought with reckless aggression. On June 7th, elements of the 12th SS counterattacked Canadian positions at Ory and Buron. The North Nova Scotia Highlanders and Sherbrooke Fusiliers fought a day-long battle against superior German armor. Canadian losses were heavy, with 128 killed and 89 wounded, but the line held. German forces failed to drive Canadians back to the coast. More troubling were reports that 12th SS troops executed Canadian prisoners. At the Ab Darden, German soldiers shot 20 Canadian prisoners. At other locations, wounded Canadians were killed. These war crimes enraged Canadian forces and changed rules of engagement. Fighting around Caen dragged through June into July. Carpick Airfield, a D-Day objective still uncaptured, became the focus of Operation Windsor in early July. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles and Regina Rifle Regiment, supported by Fort Garry horse tanks, attacked German positions at the airfield. The assault began at 500 hours on July 4th. German resistance was by days ferocious. Every hangar, building, and meter of runway was contested. Canadian infantry advanced under heavy machine gun and mortar fire. Tanks knocked out German anti-tank positions but took losses from concealed 88 guns. By evening, Canadians controlled most of the airfield, but German forces held adjacent Carpet Village. Fighting continued through July 5th. On July 6th, German defenders withdrew. The airfield was secured, but Canadian casualties exceeded 400. On July 8th, Canadians participated in Operation Charwood, a major assault on Caen. 2nd Canadian Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Guy Simons, attacked from the west, while British forces attacked from the north. The assault followed massive aerial bombardment that dropped 2,500 tons of bombs on German positions. Canadian infantry and armor pushed into northern Caen suburbs. House-to-house fighting lasted 3 days. Canadians used mouse-hauling tactics developed at Ortona. By July 9th, Canadian forces controlled northern Caen. The city was not fully liberated until August, but the July offensive broke German defensive lines and opened routes for Allied breakout operations. The breakthrough came in August with Operation Totalize, a Canadian-led assault designed to punch through German defenses south of Caen. General Simons planned the operation personally, developing innovative tactics, including night attacks with armored columns guided by radio beacons and tracer fire. Simons understood daylight attacks against prepared German positions resulted in massive casualties. Attacking at night would negate German defensive advantages. He solved coordination challenges with technology and discipline. Radio beacons marked assembly areas. Tracer rounds fired at precise intervals marked direction. Pathfinder tanks with specialized navigation equipment led each column. On the night of August 7th, 800 Canadian and Polish tanks and armored vehicles attacked German positions under darkness. The assault achieved complete surprise. German defenders expecting only daylight attacks were overwhelmed. Anti-tank guns could not target what they could not see. Canadian armored columns smashed through defensive positions, advanced 7 kilometers in 12 hours, and created gaps in German lines that infantry exploited. The following day, German commanders reacted quickly. By August 8th, Tiger tanks from 1st SS Panzer Corps counterattacked. The next 3 days saw intense tank battles across open farmland south of Caen. Canadian and Polish forces fought German armor in running engagements, destroying hundreds of vehicles. The fighting demonstrated Canadian ability to conduct complex armored operations at corps level. Operation Tractable followed on August 14th. Another Simons planned offensive aimed at closing the Files Gap. Canadian forces attacked in daylight, but used smoke screens to blind German defensive positions. Heavy bombers dropped thousands of tons of bombs on German rear areas, while artillery fired continuous barges. Canadian infantry and armor pushed south toward Files, while American forces advanced north from the opposite direction. The goal was encircling German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army. By August 16th, Canadian and Polish forces reached Files. The gap between Canadian and American forces narrowed to just km. Thousands of German soldiers tried escaping through the shrinking corridor. Allied artillery and air power inflicted devastating casualties. The final closure of the Files Gap became controversial among historians. Some argue Montgomery or Bradley should have closed the pocket faster. Others point out Canadian and Polish forces fought continuously for 2 weeks under intense pressure and closed the gap as quickly as tactically possible. The debate obscures the accomplishment. Canadian forces helped destroy the German force defending Normandy since D-Day. Between 50,000 and 100,000 German soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured in the Falaise pocket. German combat power in France collapsed. Without the Falaise victory, German forces might have established new defensive lines, prolonging the campaign for months. By the end of August 1944, Canadian First Army, operating as an independent formation under General Harry Kerr, had proven itself repeatedly. The true test of Canadian capabilities came in September and October with the Battle of the Scheldt, which would become the most important Canadian military operation of the entire war. After Paris liberation, Allied forces advanced rapidly across France and Belgium. By early September, British forces captured Belgian port city Antwerp with dock facilities intact. Antwerp was the second largest port in Europe, capable of handling enormous supply volumes. One problem remained. Antwerp sat at the end of an 80 km river, controlled by German forces until the Scheldt Estuary was cleared. Antwerp remained useless. Montgomery gave the Shell mission to Canadian First Army. It was considered necessary but miserable work. The terrain was polar country, land reclaimed from the sea below sea level and crisscrossed with canals and dikes. Germans had flooded large areas, turning the battlefield into mud and water maze. Defensive positions were exceptionally strong. German 15th Army, commanded by General Gustav von Zengen, had orders to hold the Scheldt at all costs. Von Zengen had experienced troops, excellent positions, and terrain favoring defense. Canadian commanders knew the operation would be costly. The attack required clearing 4 separate areas. First, the Brands Pocket south of the Estuary. Second, the South Beaverland Peninsula. Third, Walcheren Island at the Estuary mouth. Fourth, the area north of Antwerp. Each presented unique challenges. Canadian 2nd Infantry Division attacked the Branson's Pocket on October 2nd. The assault began with amphibious landing across the Brockman Inlet, bypassing German defenses along the Leopold Canal. Canadian infantry came ashore in Buffalo, amphibious vehicles under heavy German fire. The landing succeeded, but follow-up operations bogged down in flooded fields and fierce German resistance. Every village, dike, and canal crossing required hard fighting. Canadian casualties mounted steadily. Terrain was so difficult, tanks were useless. Infantry advanced through waist-deep water under constant artillery and mortar fire. The worst day for Canadian forces came October 13th. The Black Watch Regiment from Montreal attacked a German position at Vuender, a village controlling access to South Beamed Peninsula. German forces, including 6th Parachute Regiment, defended with determination. The Black Watch advanced across open ground under heavy fire. The attack failed. The regiment suffered 145 casualties, including 56 killed. German forces captured 27 more. It was devastating loss for a single battalion in one day. Despite setbacks, Canadians continued fighting. By late October, they cleared the Brands Pocket and advanced onto South Beaverland Peninsula. The final phase was assaulting Walcheren Island. British forces conducted amphibious landings at West Capelle and Flushing, while Canadian troops attacked across the narrow causeway connecting South Beaverland to Walter. The causeway assault became legendary in Canadian military history. The causeway was 40 m wide, elevated above flooded fields on both sides with no cover. German forces had perfect fields of fire along the entire length. Canadian units attacked repeatedly between October 31st and November 2nd. Each attack was repulsed with heavy casualties. The Calgary Highlanders lost nearly an entire company in a single assault, yet attacks continued. Canadian commanders knew the causeway had to be taken to draw German attention from amphibious landings. On November 2nd, British and Canadian forces converged on Walcheren from multiple directions. German defenders realized they were surrounded. Organized resistance collapsed November 8th. The Battle of the Scheldt lasted 5 weeks. Canadian First Army, including British and Polish units, suffered 12,873 casualties. 6,367 were Canadian. Canadian 2nd Infantry Division alone lost 3,650 men in 33 days, but the mission succeeded. On November 28th, the first Allied convoy entered Antwerp, led by Canadian-built freighter Fort Cataraqui. Antwerp became the primary supply base for Allied forces driving into Germany. Without Antwerp, the Allied advance would have stalled. Without the Scheldt operation, Antwerp would have remained unusable. American historian Charles MacDonald wrote that the Scheldt operation demonstrated Canadian Army's ability to conduct complex multi-phase operations in worst possible terrain against determined opposition. British historian Terry Kopp called the Scheldt one of the most grueling and significant battles fought by Canadian forces in World War II. The battle proved Canadian commanders could plan and execute major operations independently, and Canadian soldiers could overcome any challenge through skill, courage, and determination. By early 1945, Canadian First Army was recognized as one of premier formations in Allied order of battle. The final test came with Netherlands' liberation, a campaign that would cement Canada's reputation and create bonds of friendship lasting generations. After the Scheldt victory, Canadian forces spent winter 1944 to 1945 holding defensive positions along the Mars River. For 3 months between November 8, 1944 and February 8, 1945, Canadians were not involved in large-scale operations. Rest was desperately needed. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division and 2nd Canadian Armoured Brigade had been fighting since D-Day. Other units joined in July. 5 months of continuous combat had devastated battalions through killed, wounded, and battle exhaustion casualties. In February 1945, Allies launched the Great Offensive to drive Germans back over the Rhine and bring about Germany's final defeat. 1st Canadian Army under General Kerr was strengthened with Allied formations, making it the largest army a Canadian officer ever commanded in action. The army advanced from Nijmegen salient southeastward to clear the corridor between Rhine and Mars rivers. Fighting through February and March in what became known as the Battle of the Rhineland, Canadian forces faced appalling terrain conditions. Historian Dwight Eisenhower wrote to Kra expressing admiration for conducting the attack under conditions more difficult than probably any assault in the war. It spoke volumes for Canadian skill, determination, and soldier valor that they carried it through to successful conclusion. On March 23, 1945, Allies launched Operation Plunder, crossing the Rhine River. Canadian engineers played crucial roles building Bailey pontoon bridges and floating prefabricated bridges into position. By March end, Canadian units moved north, taking Emmerich on the Rhine's right bank. On April 1st, 1st Canadian Corps under Major General Charles Foulkes replaced 1st British Corps under Canadian First Army Command, giving Kerr direct control of both Canadian Corps for the first time since Normandy. After crossing the Rhine, Canadian First Army received 2 tasks. First, liberate Western Netherlands. Second, march through northeastern Netherlands and northern Germany to the Vasa River. The Western Netherlands task proved particularly urgent. Dutch civilians had suffered through the hunger winter of 1944 to 1945. In retaliation for a railway workers' strike, Germans banned all inland freight movement. This prevented food grown in the north from reaching southern and western population centers. Approximately 18,000 Dutch civilians starved to death. Millions more suffered severe malnutrition in what became the most devastating famine in Dutch history. Canadian forces launched liberation operations in early April. 2nd Canadian Infantry Division attacked northeastern Netherlands liberating cities including Almelo on April 5, Zeuthen on April 8, Deventer on April 12, and Groningen on April 16. The Battle of Groningen saw intense urban fighting as Canadian troops cleared German defenders house by house and street by street. German forces fought tenaciously despite knowing the war was lost. Every street corner became a potential ambush point. Every building required clearing. Canadian soldiers used experience gained at Ortona and in Normandy urban fighting to methodically reduce German strong points. The liberation of Arnhem came between April 12 and 16. This was the city British paratroopers tried desperately to hold during Operation Market Garden in September 1944. That operation failed catastrophically with British 1st Airborne Division nearly annihilated. Now Canadian forces supported by British 49th Infantry Division and armor from 5th Canadian Armoured Division took the city in 4 days of coordinated operations. Canadian engineers demonstrated remarkable skill building Bailey bridges under fire and floating prefabricated bridges into position across the Jazel and Nidarine rivers, allowing armor to cross faster than Germans expected. Canadian pioneers laid heavy artillery smoke screens over Arnhem during the attack, deceiving Germans about the true crossing direction. 1st Canadian Corps operations in Western Netherlands focused on liberating Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and The Hague. Dutch civilians in this densely populated area had suffered most during the Hunger Winter. Canadian forces faced delicate challenges. Using overwhelming firepower against German positions would reduce Canadian casualties, but endanger Dutch civilians living in close proximity. Canadian commanders chose to minimize artillery use and rely more heavily on infantry tactics, even though this increased their own casualties. Dutch civilians' welfare took priority. On April 17th, 1st Canadian Corps liberated April Dawn. A 7-year-old girl named Elizabeth Calf was among the liberated citizens. A unit of the Royal Canadian Corps of Signals stationed in April Dawn adopted her as an honorary captain, presenting her with captain's rank insignia and unit shoulder flashes. Her mother sewed these onto a blue sweater that Lisp wore every day for years, a tangible symbol of Canadian kindness during liberation. By April 21st, Canadian forces reached the North Sea, having captured Zoll and Leiden along the way. The 2nd Canadian Corps then turned east toward German towns of Emden, Wilhelmshaven, and Oldenburg, clearing the German coast of remaining Wehrmacht forces. On April 28th, Germans agreed to a truce allowing movement of food supplies to starving Dutch populations behind the Grebbe Line. Canadian forces and Allied air forces immediately began Operation Manor and Operation Chow Hound, dropping food supplies to desperate civilians. These mercy missions prevented thousands more deaths in the final days before German surrender. On May 4th, Canadian soldiers received messages to halt all operations with ceasefire effective at 800 hours May 5th. General Foch, commander of 1st Canadian Corps, accepted the surrender of German forces in the Netherlands on May 5th. On May 7th, Germany unconditionally surrendered. The war in Europe officially ended. Canadian soldiers who had fought since Sicily or Normandy could finally rest. Stuart Johns of the Canadian Grenadier Guards remembered the moment. The relief was overwhelming yet tinged with sorrow for comrades who died in the final weeks of a war everyone knew was ending. Canadian forces were greeted as heroes throughout the Netherlands. Jubilant crowds thronged streets mobbing liberating soldiers. Dutch civilians showered Canadians with flowers, kisses, and gratitude. The spontaneous celebrations became known as the Sweetest Spring. Civilians surrounding Sherman tanks, children riding on armored vehicles, entire families embracing Canadian soldiers became iconic images of liberation. The gratitude was genuine and profound. Dutch people had endured 5 years of brutal occupation and near starvation. Canadian soldiers brought not just military liberation but food, medical supplies, and hope. More than 7,600 Canadian service personnel died during Netherlands operations from September 1944 through May 1945. This represented significant sacrifice in the war's final months. Many Canadians killed in April 1945 died knowing victory was imminent but unable to see it. Private Harry Brought was killed by German artillery in April Dawn on April 15th. The same bombardment destroyed Dutch civilian Nellie van Denburg's house. After the war, she wrote to Harry's widow, Ruth Brought, telling her about his death and expressing gratitude for Canadian sacrifice. Such personal connections between Dutch civilians and Canadian families became common. The Netherlands' liberation created bonds between Canada and the Netherlands that endure today. Dutch schools teach children about Canadian liberation. Canadian war cemeteries in the Netherlands, including Gross Canadian War Cemetery, are maintained impeccably with Dutch volunteers tending graves. Every year on May 4th and 5th, Dutch citizens hold remembrance ceremonies honoring Canadian liberators. Thousands of Dutch women married Canadian soldiers, becoming war brides who immigrated to Canada. Princess Juliana of the Netherlands took refuge in Canada during the war, and her daughter Princess Margaret was born in Ottawa in January 1943. Canadian Parliament declared her hospital room extraterritorial, ensuring the child retained Dutch citizenship. In gratitude, the Netherlands sends 100,000 tulip bulbs to Canada annually. Ottawa's Canadian Tulip Festival celebrates this enduring friendship. Leadership made the difference. Lieutenant General Guy Simonds became one of the finest corps commanders of the war. He was innovative, aggressive, willing to adopt new tactics and technologies. His night-armored assault for Operation Totalize influenced armored doctrine for decades. Montgomery, despite his difficult personality, recognized Simonds' abilities and gave him operational independence uncommon for Commonwealth commanders. Major General Christopher Vaux, who commanded 1st Canadian Infantry Division in Italy, was blunt, tough, and effective. His soldiers respected him because he shared their dangers and ensured they had necessary support. Individual Canadian soldiers demonstrated extraordinary courage throughout the war. Captain Paul Try of the Royal 22nd Regiment earned the Victoria Cross at Casa Barati in Italy on December 14, 1943. His company attacked a German strong point and was reduced to 14 men and 4 tanks by heavy fire. Try personally led remaining troops forward, captured the position, and held it against repeated counterattacks for 24 hours. Private Ernest Smith of the Seth Highlanders earned the Victoria Cross near the Savio River in Italy on October 21, 1944. When his section came under fire from 2 German tanks and multiple machine guns, Smith grabbed a Pat anti-tank weapon, destroyed 1 tank, drove off the second, and single-handedly attacked machine gun positions. Major John Mahoney of the Westminster Regiment earned the Victoria Cross in the Mela River crossing in Italy on May 24, 1944. He led his company across the river under heavy fire, established a bridgehead, and held it against German counterattacks for 6 hours despite being wounded twice. These Victoria Cross recipients represented thousands of Canadian soldiers who fought with equal courage in less recognized circumstances. Every Canadian division had men who performed extraordinary acts in combat. Canadian Army capability was built on these individuals, soldiers who refused to accept defeat even when odds were against them. Why were Canadian capabilities underestimated initially? Part of the answer lies in inexperience. The Canadian Army had not fought a major war since 1918. By 1939, the Army had shrunk to fewer than 5,000 regular soldiers. Building an army from scratch takes time, and Canadian forces spent years training before seeing combat. The Dieppe disaster in 1942 reinforced perceptions that Canadian soldiers were brave but poorly led and insufficiently prepared. But that perception ignored reality. After Dieppe, the Canadian Army conducted comprehensive analysis of what went wrong. Major General John Hamilton Roberts, who commanded at Dieppe, was removed from combat command. Training intensified with focus on combined arms coordination. Tactical doctrine was revised based on lessons learned at terrible cost. New equipment was issued and soldiers trained extensively. When Canadian forces landed in Sicily in July 1943, they were a different army than the one that attacked Dieppe. Better led, better trained, better equipped. By D-Day, they were a mature, professional force capable of executing complex operations under worst conditions. Another factor was prejudice. British and American commanders viewed Commonwealth forces, particularly Canadian and Australian units, as colonial troops, enthusiastic but lacking professional army sophistication. This prejudice was rarely stated openly, but influenced planning decisions. Canadian units were often assigned to secondary objectives or defensive roles. When Canadian forces proved their capabilities in combat, prejudice gave way to respect, but grudgingly. Even after the war, Canadian contributions were often downplayed in British and American military histories. Books about D-Day focus on Omaha Beach and American heroism. Books about the Italian campaign emphasize British and American operations. Canadian achievements are mentioned but rarely given deserved prominence, yet evidence is clear. On D-Day, Canadians advanced furthest. In Italy, Canadians fought through the Gustav Line and Hitler Line. Normandy, Canadians closed the Fawlett's Gap. At the Scheldt, Canadians opened Antwerp. These were not minor contributions. These were decisive operations directly affecting the war outcome. The port of Antwerp alone justified Canadian casualties in the Scheldt. Without Antwerp, Allied logistics would have been crippled going into winter 1944. The German offensive that became the Battle of the Bulge specifically targeted Antwerp because German commanders understood its importance. Canadian forces fought throughout the war at the same level as elite British and American divisions. In some operations, they performed better. This was not luck. This was capability built through training, leadership, innovation, and determination to prove doubters wrong. The statistics tell part of the story. More than 1 million Canadians served in uniform during World War II from a population of only 11 million. The Canadian Army sent 5 divisions overseas, plus independent brigades, armored regiments, and supporting units. Canadian forces fought for 5 years from 1940 through 1945. 42,000 Canadians died in service during the war. 22,900 were Army personnel. For a nation of 11 million people, those numbers represent extraordinary sacrifice. But numbers alone do not capture capability. Capability is measured in battlefield results. On D-Day, 3rd Canadian Infantry Division advanced further inland than any other Allied division. At Ortona in Italy, Canadian forces fought through house-to-house combat against German paratroopers and secured a key position on the Gustav Line. At Fawlett's, Canadian troops helped close the gap that trapped German 7th Army. At the Scheldt, Canadian forces accomplished the mission that opened Antwerp and enabled Allied logistics for the final drive into Germany. Montgomery himself, initially skeptical of Canadian capabilities, changed his assessment after witnessing Canadian combat performance. By late 1944, he considered General Simons one of the finest corps commanders in Allied and armies. Montgomery later wrote that the Canadian Army learned to fight effectively under his command. While Montgomery's assessment was characteristically self-serving, it acknowledged Canadian forces evolved into a highly professional combat army. What Montgomery failed to fully credit was that Canadians did not simply follow British doctrine. They innovated. Mouse-hauling tactics used at Ortona and in Normandy became standard urban warfare techniques studied by militaries after the war. Night armored assault tactics developed by Simons for Operation Totalize influenced armored doctrine for decades. Canadian military engineering, particularly in amphibious and river crossing operations, set standards for combined arms operations. The deeper question is why Canadian capabilities were underestimated initially. Beyond inexperience and prejudice, there was the depth factor. That disaster reinforced perceptions that Canadian soldiers were brave but poorly led and insufficiently prepared for modern warfare. But perception ignored what happened after Dieppe. The Canadian Army conducted ruthless self-examination. They identified every tactical error, every coordination failure, every equipment deficiency. They corrected those problems through 2 years of intensive training. When Canadian forces landed in Sicily in July 1943, they were fundamentally different from the force that attacked Dieppe. Better leadership, better tactics, better integration of infantry, armor, and artillery. By D-Day, they were a mature professional force. Canadian contributions were often downplayed in post-war histories written by British and American authors. Books focus on Omaha Beach, Market Garden, the Bulge. Canadian operations receive mentions but rarely detailed analysis. This historiographical bias obscures the reality. Canadian forces fought some of the war's toughest battles. Ortona was as brutal as any urban combat in Europe. The Scheldt was as difficult as any campaign fought in Northwest Europe. Fiolets was as important as any encirclement operation of the war. These battles directly affected the war's outcome, yet remain relatively unknown outside Canada. The Canadian Army's transformation from 1939 to 1945 represents one of the war's remarkable military developments. Canada entered the war with fewer than 5,000 regular Army personnel. By war's end, over 1 million Canadians had served in uniform from a population of 11 million. The Army fielded 5 full divisions overseas, multiple independent armored brigades, artillery regiments, and extensive support formations. This expansion required not just recruitment, but developing professional officer corps, establishing effective training systems, and creating logistical infrastructure to support forces fighting on multiple continents simultaneously. The quality of Canadian military leadership evolved dramatically. Early war commanders like Major General Andrew McNaughton focused on keeping Canadian forces together as a national formation rather than dispersing them under British command. While this preserved Canadian identity, it also delayed combat deployment. McNaughton's replacement by practical combat commanders like Craw and Simons marked a shift toward aggressive innovative leadership focused on winning battles rather than preserving autonomy. Simons in particular proved himself among the war's finest corps commanders through tactical innovation and willingness to adopt new technologies and methods. Canadian tactical innovations influenced Allied warfare beyond immediate battlefield results. The mouse-hauling technique developed at Ortona became standard urban warfare doctrine studied worldwide. Night armored assaults pioneered by Simons for Operation Totalize demonstrated that properly coordinated armor could attack successfully in darkness, negating defensive advantages of anti-tank guns. Canadian military engineers set standards for rapid bridge construction and river crossing operations that influenced post-war military engineering worldwide. These innovations emerged from necessity, combined with willingness to experiment rather than rigidly following established doctrine. The cost of Canadian achievement was substantial. 42,000 Canadians died during World War II. 22,900 were Army personnel. Approximately 60,000 were wounded. These casualties came from a nation of 11 million people, representing sacrifice proportionally comparable to much larger nations. Every Canadian community contributed soldiers. Farm towns in Saskatchewan, fishing villages in Nova Scotia, industrial cities in Ontario and Quebec, all sent young men who never returned. The human cost extended beyond statistics to thousands of families permanently marked by loss. Canadian military capability in World War II must be measured against both achievements and context. Canadian forces fought some of the war's toughest battles. Ortona earned comparison to Stalingrad for urban fighting intensity. The Scheldt challenged troops with terrain as difficult as any in Europe. Juno Beach on D-Day had defenses second only to Omaha in strength. In every case, Canadian forces succeeded often at heavy cost, but always accomplishing assigned objectives. This success came despite initial inexperience, prejudice from allies, and limited resources compared to British and American forces. Context matters when evaluating Canadian performance. Canadian soldiers were predominantly volunteers serving far from home. They received extensive training, but most had no combat experience before Sicily or Normandy. They faced veteran German troops who had fought on multiple fronts. Despite these challenges, Canadian forces consistently performed at levels matching or exceeding more experienced Allied formations. This speaks to quality of training, leadership effectiveness, and soldier determination. The relationship between Canadian forces and Allied command remained complicated throughout the war. Montgomery's patronizing attitude toward Canadian commanders created tensions that persisted despite Canadian battlefield successes. American generals largely ignored Canadian contributions in their post-war memoirs and histories. British military historians often minimized Canadian roles in operations, emphasizing British and American efforts instead. This historiographical bias means Canadian achievements remain underappreciated outside Canada despite their significance. Modern military historians increasingly recognize Canadian contributions. Works by Terry Kopp, Mark Zulka, and others have documented Canadian operations with detail and analysis comparable to studies of American and British forces. These historians demonstrate that Canadian divisions fought as effectively as any Allied formation, and sometimes more effectively than formations with greater resources and experience. Academic recognition slowly corrects popular misconceptions, but public awareness remains limited. The enduring Canadian-Dutch friendship represents perhaps the war's most tangible legacy of Canadian military service. No other Allied nation maintained such close bonds with a liberated country decades after the war. Dutch gratitude stems from Canadian sacrifice during liberation and subsequent occupation duties, where Canadian soldiers treated civilians with respect and compassion. Canadian troops shared limited rations with starving civilians, provided medical care, and maintained discipline, preventing the looting and abuse that sometimes accompanied other armies. These actions created lasting goodwill beyond merely military liberation. Canadian veterans returned home, changed by experiences. Men who left as farm boys or factory workers came back having seen combat's brutality and witnessed European devastation. Many struggled with what today would be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Others channeled wartime experiences into post-war careers and community service. Company Sergeant Major Charles Martin exemplified this pattern, returning to his Ontario community, where he served as school trustee, volunteer, and community leader, while working his government job and operating a small business with his wife. His memoir, written 50 years after D-Day, ensured his generation's experiences would be preserved for future Canadians. The question of Canadian Army capability in World War II has a clear answer by historical evidence. The Canadian Army was highly capable, demonstrated through consistent success in difficult operations across multiple theaters over 5 years of warfare. From Sicily through Italy, from Juno Beach through Fiolets, from the Scheldt through Netherlands liberation, Canadian forces accomplished every major objective assigned. Despite initial inexperience and skepticism from allies, they innovated tactically, fought tenaciously, and earned respect through battlefield performance rather than reputation or resources. This capability emerged from specific factors. Rigorous training over 4 years before major combat operations prepared soldiers thoroughly. Lessons from Dieppe disaster were ruthlessly analyzed and corrected. Leadership evolved from cautious staff officers to aggressive combat commanders willing to innovate. Soldiers fought with determination born from knowing their nation's reputation, and their comrades' lives depended on success. The combination of preparation, learning from failure, strong leadership, and soldier determination created an army capable of matching any in the world despite limited resources and peacetime military tradition. Canadian military history deserves greater recognition internationally. The Canadian Army in World War II represents small nation making disproportionate contributions to Allied victory. Canadian divisions fought in Kaya, some of Europe's most important battles. Canadian sacrifices helped liberate millions from Nazi occupation. Canadian innovations influenced military tactics worldwide. Yet, these contributions remain relatively unknown outside Canada because post-war narratives emphasized American and British roles while minimizing Commonwealth contributions. On June 6, 1944, Company Sergeant Major Charles Martin led his men ashore at Bernier-Sumer. Knowing Canadian reputation hung in the balance, Allied commanders doubted whether Canadians could succeed where Dieppe had failed catastrophically. By nightfall, Canadian 3rd Infantry Division had advanced further inland than any other Allied division, secured all objectives, and proven doubters wrong. That pattern repeated throughout the war. Underestimated initially, Canadians proved capable repeatedly through battlefield success from inexperienced divisions in 1939, to combat proven formations liberating the Pontius Netherlands. In 1945, the Canadian Army earned its reputation one battle at a time. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. Your support helps us share these forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with untold histories that shaped our world. Each story matters. Each sacrifice deserves to be remembered. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community includes viewers from around the globe. From veterans to history enthusiasts, all united by respect for those who served. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories